right, I think we'll get started here. Welcome this evening to the Planning Commission for the Village of Morton. Today is Monday, November 27th. First order of business is roll call.
Elam. Farrell.
Here.
Keach.
Here.
Neff.
Here.
Fick.
Here.
Ritterbush.
Here.
Smock.
Here.
Westlake.
Here.
Zobrist.
Here.
Have a quorum?
Full house. First order this evening is the approval of minutes from our last meeting, which was October 23rd. In your packet, there was the meeting of minutes. One item I noted on petition number 17-12, special use. I abstained on that one. I had a fiduciary interest in that development, so I thought it was best to abstain. Other than that, any questions or comments on the agenda from last meeting? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve as amended?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Matt. Anyone else? Second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Call when ready.
Voice roll, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same.
Thank you. Okay, next up we have our public hearing section. Despite the fact that there's no public in attendance, our attorney will give a brief summation of his role.
Thank you. Well, we're here tonight on published notice for 4 public hearings on potential amendments to our village code. Any person wishing to address the Plan Commission, if he were to be here and present in person, would be afforded the opportunity to do so. At the conclusion of the public hearing, the Plan Commission will make recommendations to the village board. The Plan Commission makes recommendations only. The village board is responsible for final action on these matters.
Great, thank you. All right, so this evening what we're going to do, guys, just a little bit different, is we'll go through each of these ordinances, starting with the first, and then Roger's going to kind of give some basis for what we're looking at here. I think everyone's read these. We've had some dialogue. Let's go through this and start with the ordinance making amendments to Section 4, Chapter 9, Title 10. This is regarding temporary signs. Okay, Roger?
Thank you. Give you a little background, particularly on this one. Maybe 7 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a local realtor asking if I had picked up 2 of her directional signs, not the sign that says for sale in front of the house, but the ones that you might see that are all about every street corner, has a number of them now. And I said, no, we don't. We've never messed with real estate signs, so I don't know where your signs went. But I said, since you asked me that question, because I've already been mowing this around, there's so many of those things, and they don't do anything to make your village look attractive. And then they get blown out in the street and who knows where. I said, let me ask you your opinion of that. I mean, and before I do give yours, I'm going to tell you that I'm thinking we shouldn't have these signs. And for those reasons that I mentioned. And she agreed. She goes, the only reason I have them is because the other people have them, and I don't want to be the one out there that doesn't put these signs up. So over the next few weeks, I talked to Pat, and then I talked with probably 6 local realtors. I didn't want to surprise them. I wouldn't want them to read this in the paper and feel like they got hit over the head with something. So I talked to them personally. And to the person, nobody really has an objection to this. And most of them even said the same thing. They go, I'd welcome that because we don't have to buy them. We don't have to take care of them. And people they use their phone or their, GPS to find a house. They aren't going around looking for these directional signs to get them there. So everybody seemed to be okay. The only 2 comments I got were, they said, in other communities, which we're one of the only ones right now that allow these. Most of the surrounding communities don't allow these signs at all. But they said they feel like the people that are selling a property for themselves, like for sale by owner or for rent, they don't enforce that on them. And I go, well, I would do it on everyone. Everybody's going to be playing by the same rule, whether you're me, Roger Spangler, selling my house, or a commercial realtor, they're all going to be treated the same. They can't be there. And they were both good with that then. So I don't think we're not asking them to do something that's impossible, and I don't think it's really going to have much of an effect on on their business, at least from the 6 that I talked to.
Okay, good.
Now, that's on this temporary sign.
Right.
And on the one, on that page 2 of that same ordinance, the only thing I'm suggesting, and that was suggested to me by a couple of them, was where it says this directional signs can be put up on, from Friday noon, that we remove the noon and just make it from Friday, which I'm not gonna be out there looking to see, did you put that sign up at 11 o'clock? And so that would be the only thing I think that we could strike and change if it's okay with you as we forward this on to the village board.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, obviously the table can speak to this. I don't see any issue with it at all. You know, obviously, if you've spoken to some of the realtors in town, I think they're the ones that would probably going to have the concerns with this. I've never thought those signs really do a whole lot. I mean, technology has changed the way people shop now, and a lot of this stuff is kind of becoming, you know, unneeded. But
I mean, most of the intersections that you pull up to, there's going to be at least one quadrant of that intersection that's going to have signs. Some of them, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 at one corner, and I don't know, it just doesn't look good.
okay, so that's sort of the justification behind this ordinance coming before us. Any questions or comments from the table? Any thoughts on this? Sounds like Roger's done some homework on it, and I know.
With Pat. I'm not taking, no, I don't want all the.
Roger drafted this. Let's get that on.
He already knows that I'm not a professional writer, and I don't take personally any comments he's going to make back to me, so.
One point to supplement, there was one additional issue that while we were hitting the temporary signs, we had some businesses essentially contend that their signs were temporary because they were there for a year or so, and our code didn't have any sort of definition of what a temporary sign meant. It permits temporary signs without a permit. So the Roger's explanation about the realty signs, it would be new paragraphs 12 and a revision of paragraph 9, or subparagraphs 9 and 12 in a subsection. We also added in an 11, and this wouldn't be on realty signs, but you know, business signs, commercial signs, to give some idea of what really is intended by a temporary sign. Give us some more concrete standard than what existed in the code now, which is not much. So that was one additional purpose for this ordinance.
When it comes to retail stores and downtown environments, how are we treating small signs that are placed in front of the businesses, let's say on Saturday morning, that show specials or might direct retail traffic into their store for certain items and things? For example, you know, let's say Coldwell Banker's Morton office wanted to put a sign out on that corner on a Saturday that said, you know, free hot chocolate to direct business in, or I think of Seasons or Kemp 208 showing, you know, dinner specials for the evening. Are we handling those in a way where we're sort of looking the other way to some extent?
I would say, right now, we have a couple places that have those on Main Street. I just walked by the one at the ice cream, the popcorn shop last night. They've got a little
Yep.
small thing. And then sometimes that 208 will have a sign out with maybe specials, that type of thing. And yeah, and I haven't done anything with them because we're trying to encourage people to do these things downtown.
And I'm in agreement with that philosophy, and that's why I just want to make sure as we look at these signs that we don't inadvertently sort of prohibit what is already, you know, retail's tough enough, and so I want to make sure that as a community we're trying to be good to them. But I also know that we've got to try to keep fair rules around for everyone. So just another thought as we look at these things, how they might impact businesses that we're not directly targeting with this ordinance. At the end of the day, it comes down to you know, to regulating it as well. And so obviously, if the rules are there and we're targeting what we want to target.
And we did actually, just so you each know, that several weeks ago, I would have brought this up to the village board so that they could actually direct us to hold this public hearing, and they were supportive of.
Sure.
I first explained it to trustee Blunier and our mayor, and then to the whole board before bringing it to you folks.
Any other thoughts or comments from the table tonight? Just a point of note here, we are ruling on these this evening. So if there are alterations, changes, or continued discussion, we need to make sure that we bring that up now. Otherwise, we'll be looking for a motion.
I'd make a motion to approve striking the noon behind Friday and item 9.
Okay, the motion has been made to strike the timeline from, this is from paragraph 9.
Yes.
Everyone see that?
We're gonna leave the 6 o'clock on Sunday?
Yeah, that seems to be standard in the area from the other communities that I talked to, that 6 o'clock thing. So. And again, I
You're
won't
not
be
going
out there
out
at
at
6 o'clock
6:01?
on Sunday night checking. So.
Do we have a second for that motion?
I second that motion.
Thank you.
To clarify before you ask for further discussion or call, is that to only make that change, or is it to recommend approval of the ordinance with that amendment?
As I understand it, it was to make the change and recommend approval.
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
Good.
Want to make sure
Second,
everybody was on the
making
same
change.
page. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this before we vote? Call when ready.
Keach,
Yes.
Neff,
Yes.
Fick,
Yes.
Ritterbusch,
Yes.
Smock,
Yes.
Westlake,
Yes.
Zobrist,
Yes.
Farrell.
Yes.
Approved.
Thank you very much. Next ordinance this evening is to make amendments to the Title 10 of the Municipal Code. This is regarding sign height in the interstate corridor. We've had discussion on this previous. Roger, you want to go ahead and give us a recap?
Sure. As you know, we've had an ordinance in place for a number of years that would, one, prohibit even asking for a variance of these types of signs that are in the interstate corridor, the variance. And these are kind of linked together with the property that we have. If we kind of going to talk about both of these next two at the same time, if you don't mind.
You bet.
The next one has to do with how long a sign can stay up after a business is closed. And we kind of amended that not very long ago, but we didn't really change the length of time. And what happened, we have that Ruby Tuesday building that's set vacant for quite some time.
Yep.
Right now, their sign should be down. Store Capital is the name of the company that owns that property, and they own, it sounds like, hundreds of properties across the country. So I've had numerous conversations with those people, and the last one I had, the person I was speaking to said, well, Roger, here's the deal. He goes, we already have a property that is hard to market. We're not, obviously it's empty. That's why I don't have anybody in there now. He said, so now we're going to be forced to take down this sign, which is really a plus to whoever is going to eventually be there, with no option to put the sign back up. And so again, like I did with the this temporary sign ordinance, I talked to trustee Blunier and our mayor, and I just kind of, when I explained it to particularly the mayor, when I explained to him, he goes, well, yeah, that makes sense, that we're going to even handicap them further. And in talking with Craig Loudermilk in our office, the signs that are out there now, I don't think are offensive to anyone. They're all pretty much at the same height, which is like from 70 to 74 feet in height. And it's not like we're in some resort area where there's some grand view that you put signs up here to block that. Where we're not, there's nothing out there in that skyline, so. And
I
we
don't know if you
want
just haven't
people-
seen the water detention area at night, right when
Well-
the sun hits it perfect.
I guess I've missed it, but I think we want the people to be able to see something from the interstate and be able to get there, then get back, do their travel. But we want them to be able to stop here, where if they can't, if there's no sign that catches their attention, they're liable to blow right on by Morton and end up in either the East Peoria or Bloomington Normal, depending on the direction they're going. So we thought maybe the language that we had was pretty good, other than that if we could change that, where the sign has to come down within a year to 2 years, and then at least give the people a chance to ask for a variance if they've had to take a sign down, because I already have a person
Right.
that has a building out there, an owner, that had to take a sign down, and he doesn't like it much. And maybe this would even help him in marketing that particular property as well.
Yeah, and when we had this conversation before, I think some of these points were brought up. In a time where businesses are struggling to get tenants back in them, or at a time where we've got, as a community, quite a few signs up for commercial real estate, it does make an impact, and it is harder on the owners. Additionally, when they're attracting tenants, if the cost of a new sign has to go in and it's a non-national brand, that can be a pretty extraordinary cost. It's a burden for either the landlord or the tenant. So I think the conversation that we had last time was more around, what were we overall trying to achieve here in this interstate corridor, and what are we trying to effectively prohibit, and what are we trying to make that skyline look like? And it sounds like upon further review, what we're looking at now are 2 ordinances, but specifically the sign height variances to be allowed again under petition, potentially, and also that the vacant signs be allowed to stay up for 2 years with a blank face before they are asked to be brought down as well.
And I would mention that there's language in here that speaks specifically to what type of condition those signs need to be kept in.
Yeah.
And we would be I wouldn't be very patient with somebody that has the thing blowing in the wind.
Right,
That's either gonna fix it or take it down.
right.
And we would have the legal position to be able to force them to do that.
I saw that.
And
And I think that's fair. I mean, in my perspective, I think that if the owner's trying to market the property, they need to keep it up anyway. They
Yeah.
need to make it look presentable so that they can effectively get the market they're looking for.
and you're the realtor.
I've been told.
Yeah.
I am. Any other comments or questions? I think to keep this succinct, let's start with the sign height variance in the interstate corridor and the changes therein. Any comments or questions?
Seems like an okay idea to me, especially since it's a variance and it would be a public hearing, wouldn't it?
Right.
That's correct.
So on a property by property basis, height makes a difference, one from another, and I think that considering it in a public hearing would be okay.
And again, it's a very specific area, where these things would be considered. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, all we need is a motion.
I'll make a motion that we approve the sign height variance in the interstate corridor.
Motion made. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Go ahead and call when ready.
Neff,
Yes.
Fick,
Yes.
Ritterbusch,
Yes.
Smock,
Yes.
Westlake,
Yes.
Zobrist,
Yes.
Farrell,
Yes.
Keach.
Yes.
Approved.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us now to the second ordinance here, 1094, removal of signs for closed businesses. And again, reminding you, the update here is an increase in the timeline, but without a reduction in policing of how the sign looks during that period of time. Any comments or questions?
How did you decide on 2 years? As a,
Well, typically, I'm going to find out when, by our utility records, when the water stopped being used or the gas or whatever.
I mean, why not 3?
Yeah, I think Jeff was
Oh, you
questioning
mean, okay. How we arrived at that?
Yeah.
Because I guess to be honest with you, I wasn't sure that I would get support on the 2-year thing, so I'm kind of sneaking up on it. So
Okay.
I'm open.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the reasoning you gave to extend it for 2 sounds like it's still good for 3.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I concur. It's kind of struggle for me to say, if you're in a bad economic time, those are cyclical, and 1 or 2 years isn't normally the lifespan of a down cycle. And having somebody take down a sign like that is punitive in a situation where you're trying to rent a building, that the sign might be an actual plus. I can see where that'd be a negative if somebody's letting the property run down, but then you can fall back on if they're not maintaining.
Right.
You'd almost want to say if the property's being maintained and the taxes are being paid, then you might grant some grace.
So, do we have, our ordinance would probably not allow someone, like a business is actually active and their sign looks like junk. That would be bad. I mean,
Right.
we
We
could
could do
tell them
something,
to either
yeah.
fix the sign or take it down, right?
Right.
So, to me, I'm just talking out loud, thinking out loud here, is the main thing is that the sign looks decent and looks, it's painted and there are no cracks and so forth. And there, we've seen some properties in town where obviously there's the landlord or the owner of the property has no intention of occupying that building with anything again. So I mean, that would be a good case for just taking the sign down for sure. But I think 2 might be too short also. I think it could go longer.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, from my perspective, in commercial real estate, I can tell you that the average time on market right now is extraordinary. In 36 months, if you're being honest, is about right. It's not easy to market these properties and get somebody in them. And what's also interesting is, at least these last few years, you can have a very nice, we've used Ruby Tuesdays as a probably a really good example here. It's a great building. It's in a terrific location. Since that's been on market, I have represented developers who have built 4 brand new restaurants in adjacent areas. So despite the fact that we have a property that's ready to go, developers are building new places in new areas. So again, we're creating a cycle that is even tougher for these landlords to get out of. They're trying to compete with the new hot areas. They're trying to compete with the local market and the ebbs and flows of it. I'm always careful about how much I interject on these items because I obviously have a different perspective. Matt, in his position, is oftentimes trying to make sure the city looks good, and he's got another job. He's got to try to get signs down. So I think there's a happy medium, but my personal preference here is to not be punitive to a landlord who's trying to keep their building up. You got to imagine, if you're on market for 3 years without a tenant, and you're paying your property taxes, and you're keeping track of your building and you're maintaining it, the carry costs on something like that, excluding debt, assuming you own the building outright, on a building like Ruby Tuesdays, probably $35,000, $40,000 a year you're pumping into that building without any return on that investment. So having them pull down what could be potentially a $150,000 sign, if they're keeping it up, I don't know.
Is it too complicated to write in kind of an extension application for extension where it could be reviewed and some of these things could be determined that yes, they're keeping the property, they're making a good faith effort to sell it, they're paying their taxes? I mean, is that too complicated for this ordinance?
I like that idea.
And that would be annual or just a 1 year, one
Maybe
year?
after 2 years, then every year after that it's
Just keep it
reviewed,
open,
or I'm
maybe.
just kind of throwing
Yeah.
that out there, but.
And that would be what, how would we do that, Pat? Would that be a variance or would that be a,
Well, at that time, I suppose you'd have to add extension language to the ordinance with very specific guidelines.
Correct, and I'm just to place it in the, the box of a procedure we're accustomed to. It initially strikes me as that it would be a variance, steer them into a mechanism we already have in place, so that there's existing checks and balances for substantive due process, procedural due process. So it certainly can't, the direct answer to your question is, if that is your prerogative, it could certainly be, this ordinance could be adjusted to provide a mechanism like that for a case-by-case review.
Let's discuss that a little bit, though. What are we doing it for? Let's go backwards, and because I also want to make sure that in doing some of these things, we don't inadvertently create too much government and create too much red tape. Not that this is, but I just want to. If sometimes I find that if there's a concern I'm trying to alleviate, I start there and then I figure out if there's an easier model. If the concern is that the property be reviewed to make sure that it's not in arrears on taxes and that the property is being well maintained, well, that's going to be handled visually by Roger anyway. And if the building is not being maintained or the sign is not, he can have them pull it down anyway.
Well, the purpose of that would be that it would allow a developer or an building owner to go more than 2 years as long as he's keeping it up.
I guess I mean, do we need that model, or do we just leave this open for 5 years or indefinitely?
So what you're asking is, do we really care if signs just stay up blank
Right.
for years?
As long as they're being well maintained. I mean, if we're dealing with a ghost town with a series of, I mean, the worst case scenario we can imagine, right? Signs everywhere, well maintained. We've got bigger issues than whether or not there are signs up. And having those signs come down isn't necessarily, in my opinion, going to improve that factor. Just devil's advocating here. I think it's. I certainly think that the table is moving towards a position where we feel like we need to do something more than the 2 years. But now I just kind of think we need to discuss how do we want to handle it. Do we want to add additional paperwork and additional ordinance language to allow for it? Or do we just want to open it up?
How many of these sign, I mean, we talked about Ruby Tuesdays, but are there others that are at the 1 year limit? Like how prevalent?
Considering the one that's already been,
there's one that's already down, the former Pizza Ranch.
yeah.
It was a country kitchen initially. Well, that sign's been taken down. I think it's
Got it.
cut off about DA High, and I don't know of anything, there aren't any others that would be immediate, like come down. The next one would probably be the Speed Lube, which has been out for a while, but they're gonna put blank faces
And the
in now.
Kmart one is a joint sign, so it doesn't
Right.
Right.
fall
They
into
took
that.
their signs,
We've had before the Pizza Hut and then the Shell
Shell,
in the field.
La Fiesta, different signs that have come
Yeah.
down. They weren't, not all of them were 70 foot tall, some of them were 25, 30 foot tall.
Right, which is low too. Well, and that's where I'm kind of torn. I mean, I don't want to see a bunch of signs that are empty, right? And I totally understand if it's $150,000 sign, that's extensive, right? But if it's a smaller sign, right, this is going for everything. I don't know. I don't want to see a bunch of them, but if we don't have it that often,
I don't want to see a bunch of them either. It's tricky because the problem is, of course, if we're seeing a bunch of them, it's as much about the general market and what's happening as it is about what our ordinances state. And I think that's the issue, is that this is a sort of a cycle where we become punitive in nature to some extent for people who are trying to get their buildings leased. It's tricky. But that's why I think we want to be thoughtful in this. And I like the fact that we're already discussing how to be more friendly. Your dinner's ready, Roger.
What's typical in the rest of the community surrounding us? I mean, I don't even know what's.
Matt, do you mind sharing what you guys do over there?
It hasn't been an issue, so I'd
Well,
have
that
to
must
look
be
on the
nice.
books. Well, either that or it hasn't been brought to my attention, so. I mean, you have other mechanisms to have compliance with, tall grass, those type. I'm just trying to think if you can tie this in, if there's some compliance issues you're having. This is a pretty big hammer to hold over somebody, but maybe you don't have those types of issues with, Ruby Tuesday with whatever unsecured,
We have
doors
too
and
much
windows
of
and
commercial things, but
yeah.
Yeah, I can see if you tie some of this together with other site issues, right? Site problems. If we're struggling with someone who's out of order in other ways, then I can see this becoming one of those things we target as well. But that goes back to the original point to some extent.
I'm not sure, as a direct answer to your question, that it's necessarily the most common regulation out there. I think, Roger, when we talked, you might have mentioned to me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that the Ruby Tuesday guy kind of expressed that they own a lot of properties, a lot of places, and this is a pretty unique and onerous requirement compared to what they're used to in dealing with other communities, and that's broad scale. I don't know this for a fact, and it strikes me as that the intention of the regulation as originally drafted might have been to bring down signs that weren't in compliance with what the future vision for sign heights was. And that's just a guess, but
A
if you,
reversal of variances? In
yeah,
other words?
essentially, if you have a bunch of 70-foot signs out there and
Kind
you're,
of ungrandfather them.
yeah. But that's kind of, this type of regulation match is consistent with wanting to transform out of compliant signs within compliant signs. But again, I wasn't around then when it came in, but I'm not sure you could draw, if you pulled the communities around, I'm not sure there'd even be enough of a ordinance of this type where you could say this is a norm, a normal time period.
Yeah. I represent clients in a number of different communities, and we've had some extended periods of vacancy, and we've never had this.
I think as long as we have the option for a variance, the 3-year time limit would be acceptable.
So adding another year to the currently drafted ordinance, and then providing some mechanism for which they can extend that through a variance.
Well, as long as we don't prohibit a variance, they could always approach for a variance. I mean, you don't have to,
There's no, yeah. All we would need to do then is create,
well, as long as we don't in the ordinance prohibit them requesting a variance, they could come in after 3 years and request a variance. That goes to the zoning board of appeals.
Right.
They would have to take a look at it, and as long as they're fair and try to be impartial to various, I don't think it's a problem. I think if they extended to 3 years and then just let them, see what happens. Then if they got a problem, they'll file for a variance, and that should be able to then be taken care of, and we'll just see what happens. I mean, if there's a number of these come in and you start having 4 or 5 appeals a year, then you got another problem you need to address, and we can always address that later.
Can you do that with contingencies on it?
well, see, so that's where I was going. We're sort of talking about the same thing, but in two different ways. So in, Commissioner Smock example was, we have some petition or some sort of a regulation that gets brought to Roger or to the village to ask for an extension. What Commissioner Ritterbusch is describing is more of just a general variance, which is a very common practice, where they go before the zoning board of appeals and they request additional time after that 3 years. There would be, in that second example, no direct contingencies or prerequisites to it. It would simply be a variance to the existing zoning requirement. I think that the likelihood of that being a successful model, of course, resides solely on how the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Appeals, reviews these things, and if they are in the same zone of thought that we are, which is if the property is in compliance and everything else looks good, maybe it's not a problem. Typically, Roger, let me know if I'm wrong, variances are a little bit more difficult to get in this community, but I think that by virtue of the fact that this variance is not necessarily a request based on, well, it is based on a need. I guess the example of their need or their encumbrance is that the property is still vacant and they need that sign to help them market it.
The CBA though, their variances are property based, they're not time based, right? I mean, you wouldn't get a year extension, it would just be, fine, you don't have to worry about that rule.
Which goes back to the original discussion of, do we really even, I mean, if we're gonna lift the curtain off of it, we either need to have prerequisites or we don't. We let the ZBA make the final determination after 3 years. So that we can start to hone in on a final language here. Are we all in agreement at this table that the minimum, or the timeline needs to increase to 3 years at
Yeah,
base?
I'm fine with 3 and I'm fine with 5, I'm just not very comfortable with indefinite.
I'd go to 5 myself. I mean, 3 would be fine too, but I would go to 5. 5 goes by like that.
It does. And understanding that this is only in the interstate corridor. So we're discussing properties that are either large or that are expensive, highly assessed properties. These are not properties that are not going to be actively marketed from committed people, because they're going to be wanting to see these things full.
Well, the removal of the sign could be in any business. It could be downtown.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
it's not just,
Yeah, okay,
the
you're
only way
right.
you're gonna get the 70-foot tall sign is to be in the interstate corridor, but the rest of the signs could.
Those are the ones I'm most concerned with, but yeah, you're right, this is addressing all of them.
I guess you go to 3 years, and then it goes to the ZBA, and then they understand, so they grade the variance. Well, then now I've basically given them an indefinite, right? Which is kind of what I'm not really comfortable with. So I feel like if you go to 5 years, the ZBA is hardly going to see any. Hopefully, they'll never see any, right?
Right.
And does the variance follow the property or the property owner?
It follows the property.
That may not be what you want to do either.
Yeah, so, you know, thereby if you transfer this through sale, that variance goes with it.
Yeah.
So look at this.
This has been a very good conversation. I love it. This is good. And I agree with you, and I agree with you. There's kind of a happy medium there, I think. We give those folks the 3 or the 5 years, whatever you decide it is, and then after that, they get a 1-year extension. But each year, when that extension comes up, Roger goes by the property, make sure the sign looks good, and gives them a chance to make sure that the building is being taken care of. And then Roger can come to the extension meeting, and they say, Roger, is the building and the sign within compliance? Roger says yes, or he says no. If he says yes, they get the 1 year. And they can continue this for the next 10 years, because they do want to get that marketed. And Roger is just there to make sure they're taken care of, and it gives him the opportunity then to make sure that it is within compliance. And if it's not, Roger can say, it's okay, but the grass is too tall and there's a broken window. You fix that, come back next month and we'll give you the next variance. Or upon you completing that, you get the variance for a year, or the extension for a year. So I think it's kind of a way to keep things in order.
Is that a variance with the ZBA, or is that some other mechanism?
Not a variance.
I may have kept saying variance, I meant an extension to.
Extension, that's what I'm wondering. It's not really the
So from a
ZBA.
legal perspective, when we add caveats and we add timelines to these regulations, it does fall into gray area to some extent, does it not?
Well, when we talk about having a procedure where we make individual case-by-case determinations, we have to make sure we define a procedure that has protections where individuals have an opportunity to appeal the initial decision, where they have some procedural fairness built into our system. The reason why the variance label struck me earlier is because all those things are already defined. We already have a framework, we already have a process, we already have an application. I think there's been fair points made as to whether that's the appropriate vehicle for making case-by-case determinations here. The one thing that is a challenge, and we run into this on variances, frankly, when you have a case-by-case determination to be made, it is often very challenging to stick to the letter of what you're supposed to decide the case based on. So it certainly does present an enhanced range of gray. Is it a legal exposure to the village where I'm concerned that we're going to get sued because we made a case-by-case determination? No. So I think it's something that if that's a procedure you want in, we can do. The one thing that I would like to probably give some thought to is, if that's something you want, what's the best way to do it? Do we do sign permit and create a permit process and have an appeal process for the granting or denial of a permit, which is, I think, kind of what Rod was speaking to. Do we call it a variance? What label do we put to it? And depending on what label we put to it, that may change whether I need to add a sentence to this or a paragraph to it or 3 paragraphs.
So-
But that's not a problem if that's what you guys, have in mind.
We could create the procedure process essentially and have it inserted in this ordinance so that as a part of the process, people who are applying for these things are aware that after 3 or 5 years, this is now the procedure and that needs to be followed. The only other tricky part is we just added more to your job description, Roger.
Thank you.
You got it? Do you need me to
Job
sit in on your
security.
review, make sure that they're aware of it?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of over government, so I feel like if you go to 5, there really, hopefully, won't be very many going through that process, right? If you're saying 3 is the average, then obviously some are more.
I would say the conversation here has been proactive. I think we're all sort of on the same page. We're just trying to figure out how best to do it. And so my initial thought here is why don't we look at this 3 or 5 years? I think we're leaning towards 5 now. What if we approve this ordinance as is with a 5-year timeline? And if this starts to come up, or we recognize a point at which we're seeing this thing, we now have some of this groundwork established on how we would handle it, that we create a procedure at that time.
Makes sense.
But I don't know that it needs to be drafted now for something that isn't necessarily affecting us right now. And since this isn't apparently not a direct response to some sort of a void in our current ordinances, I think we can probably sufficiently rule on this, get the timeline increased. It will help relieve the burden of some of these property owners that are currently getting hammered by this thing and gives us some time to see how it works out. So let's talk about the timeline. Are we all in agreement that 5 years is the corrected time?
I support 5.
Does anybody have any concerns with that timeline? Okay.
That's 1,825 days, if you prefer that, what we need to insert there.
I wish you'd have put that calculator down so I could have assumed you did that in your head.
I did not do that in my head.
Okay, so just to be clear, what we are now talking about is ordinance amendment regarding removal of signs, section 1094. Specifically, we're dealing with the timeline for removal of signs, which was previously 1 year. It was presented today as 2 years. Now we are amending that further to 5 years.
So that means the speed loop sign, theoretically, would be up there.
That's correct, right?
Would be up there for
With a blank face.
With a blank face.
with a blank face.
Yeah.
And maintain.
Kept nice
And
looking.
well maintained.
Yeah, I like that last sentence that was added.
And Roger, don't forget about leap days. There's a couple leap days in that 5-year period.
Yeah, when you
Figure
go
those
5
out.
years, you got leap day.
At least 1, if not 2.
They don't just hand PhDs out.
1.25.
Okay, so is there any other conversation here before I ask for a motion? All right, do we have a motion to amend removal of signs, section 1094 of the Village Code?
I move that we amend it to 5 years and add that sentence that was added at the end to make sure that everything is being well maintained.
What Commissioner Keach is describing as a 5-year timeline for the sign, blank sign, and the sentence in question that he likes is all signs shall be maintained free from cracks, broken or missing panels, broken or missing supports, braces, poles, or framework, and in good and ordinary operating condition at all times. Motion has been made. Do we have a second?
I second.
Call when ready.
Fick,
Yes.
Ritterbush,
Yes.
Smock,
Yes?
Westlake,
Yes.
Zobrist,
Yes.
Farrell,
Yes.
Keach,
Yes.
Neff.
Yes.
Approved.
Okay, thank you. Next ordinance for discussion this evening is amendment regarding murals. This again is an amendment to, this is for section 1098 of chapter 9, Title 10 of the Morton Municipal Code. Roger, you want to give us a quick primer on this?
Sure. Pat really was more of an author here. How this, but I did want to tell you kind of how this came to be. I got either a phone call or an email, I'm not sure which now, from Leanne Brown. The EDC and Chamber, they must be looking for some of this type of artwork. And somewhere, and I don't know if it was one of these downtown development plans that we had done, it showed the building, the Bankendorf building right next to our office. Actually, that's adjacent to that parking lot, there's a big blank wall, there's not a window in it. And they had a mural of, there were like a pumpkin, it was a pumpkin theme along that wall. And so apparently there's some interest by an art store in Morton, or a shop that's open. That's where it kind of was generated from, that they would do something like this. So
A community
I got
request to some
that.
extent. Yeah.
And I took that kind of inquiry from Leanne that Roger passed along and put together what would essentially be an administrative review process and a permitting process, kind of being cognizant of the fact that we have a series of regulations on signs, and we didn't want murals to be used as an alternative or a end road around our normal advertising sign regulations. So the framework before you was I drafted from Leanne's inquiry and Roger's direction to kind of attend to the purpose that it was presented for.
Okay. So obviously we've all reviewed this and looked through it. There's a lot of language in this, and clearly that's because this is a new ordinance that is being added in. And so I think there's some conversation to be had on this. Primary question that I know has come up previous to the meeting is, okay, so we're in allowance of murals, we're in allowance of art to be placed on buildings. We know that we're prohibiting them from becoming advertisements or workarounds from our sign ordinance. How do we then police what potential messages the artwork carries? And I know that in the wording of this, obviously we've got some description on how these things are set forth and specifically what the sizes can be and things like that. But with regard to content, once we allow art as an open sort of discussion piece on a building, how do we enforce making certain that it stays within, I guess, moral parameters, and who sets those?
Looks like Roger gets to do that.
I'll get you a gavel.
The ordinance as prepared in section D specifically envisions an administrative review process. The caveat being that, and I know what you're referring to is kind of the First Amendment issue, which is that, our place in regulating art as a medium for First Amendment protected speech is content neutral regulation, which is we generally, for example, wouldn't be well-founded in denying a permit because we didn't like the words that someone or the message someone might be intending to convey by the mural they put on their building. I think, and whether or not this is a satisfactory answer to your question, I think the expectation of the requester, the limited instances where a mural might work physically in town, I think the presumption is that, and presumptions are dangerous, but the presumption is that you at least presently don't have a substantial known imminent threat of there being people who have a desire to post offensive, while First Amendment protected, but incendiary type of things and murals in and around town. But to your question, if somebody came to the village and had met all of our requirements for a mural to be posted, we don't have the ability to regulate the content, and by and large, the content of what they would be including in their mural.
Do we regulate like billboards or signs or any of that for
Billboards.
content? I mean, would it be
Oh,
the similar? I mean, you can put, like Red Rock has that little. I mean, they could really put
I wish they
something on
dim
there
it.
if they wanted to, right? Like,
The only one I'm aware of is the one that we have on our gas plant on Birchwood, right before you get to Erie. We have a gas plant on the corner on the south side. There's a big billboard there. And I'm pretty sure that when we, in the agreement that we have with Illinois Outdoor Advertising, I believe, there's something in there. There's certain things that you can't put on cigarettes or, I haven't looked at that.
does
for
Libby's
some
have a
reason.
sign? Does Libby's have a billboard when I drive by there? Like,
Did what?
does Libby's have one?
If it's signed, it doesn't.
They have a sign,
Or a large, relatively large sign, right? And
yeah, right on the corner.
they can kind of put whatever they.
Well, that's just their identification. I mean, it's just,
So the bank across has
Oh, yeah.
its digital sign where they
Yeah.
post community messages.
happy
And-
birthday.
and No, we don't, to my knowledge, we have no regulation. I mean, we have regulations on signs in terms of the size and placement on buildings and sign heights and,
I think as a business, you want people to go to your shop or whatever it is, and so you tend to post non-controversial messages, right?
Right.
Because otherwise you alienate half of your.
Yeah, and to some extent, that's how this is, in fact, policed, for lack of a better term, is that this deals with businesses and businesses only.
So this is for, okay, I didn't catch that part. So this is public, or this is for businesses, or is this public property too?
this is for businesses.
There's a section
Okay.
that specifically will prohibit this on residences.
So the schools could not put a mural on their building, in other words?
Paragraph B, 1098B, it limits murals to non-residential zoning districts and on structures with legal non-residential use in residential zoning districts. So you would envision commercial, but theoretically the school could have.
The school or even a church in that particular way could be correct, because it's a special use within a residential district.
Nothing in the section B, though, really requires a model or a reduced size copy of the mural. It just gives specifics about dimensions, but it really doesn't say what the mural looks like.
And probably the intent behind that as a drafter is protecting the village from the temptation to regulate based
Right.
on the content of the mural.
Right, so we really don't have any control over it.
Correct.
No, the judgment is going to be in the person who's putting it up, really. And I think that's what Commissioner Neep is saying, is to some extent you're sort of saying, look, we're a business. We're either going to put up something incendiary and we're going to hurt our business, or we're going to do something very community driven and hopefully help our business. And that's overall the market is going to be what dictates right or wrong on these.
The person that does the artwork on there, though, receives a copyright immediately. He can file for it, but he really originally, as soon as he put the artwork up, has a copyright on that specifically.
That I don't know.
Yeah, original works of art, the creator, whether or not they register it, would have
Right,
the initial copyright on it, absent some contractual assignment of that. Or,
right.
I mean, there are times businesses that we would call distasteful. I'll let you figure out maybe what those are in your mind, that wouldn't care about the community look of a mural.
That's true.
And it wouldn't hurt their business. It might actually help it.
Well, even churches, right? Sometimes they could push the envelope a little bit.
So right now, no one can do a mural without, does this allow murals? Or
Correct.
right now, are they just unregulated?
we would not, right now, I think a mural would fall within our signs
A sign,
ordinance.
which you can't paint on a building and.
Yep.
Okay. So right now, a mural is a sign.
Right.
So they are.
That was
regulated.
actually I don't know how many years, it's been a number of years ago, and I want to say it was when El Sombrero moved to Peoria. They had some kind of a Mexican mural on their building, and it was a big deal with the city of Peoria because they considered it artwork, the El Sombrero people, where the city of Peoria looked at it as a sign. I don't remember how it all played out in the end, but I just remember reading about it, thinking I'm glad that's happening there and not here, so.
Well, I think you want to encourage this to some degree. I mean, it kind of creates a little unique atmosphere, especially in your downtown, allows for some creativity, but I wouldn't want to be in your shoes and be the one that would have to say this is allowed or not allowed. I almost think you need some sort of a separate board or commission or something that would, kind of take the heat off the village. Maybe the EDC could help in some capacity, that they review it and they make that determination, or maybe you pre-authorize certain buildings in town, certain corners where it's more visible, rather than just, and not like you're going to have a rush on murals suddenly, but I mean, if you could handpick the first 5 or 6 and then, kind of work with the property owners. Again, I just think there needs to be some sort of a regulating review type of board that looks at the content and everything and gives an opinion, maybe to the village board, and then they can weigh in on it and vote it in or down.
But Pat, are you saying that you can't review it by content?
Correct. That would not be my preferred framework.
Because of
for-
lawsuits, right? The
Correct.
potential.
You run the risk of being accused of content-specific regulation of speech. Which is one of the reasons why, to Don's question about, we don't even ask them what they're putting up in the part of the review process, is so that we can't even be accused of saying, you knew we were gonna put, this
Message you
controversial
disagree
subject
with.
in the message, so that's why we didn't get our permit.
Yeah, you can't even really screen it based on how good the art is,
Correct. Because it's subjective.
whatever that means.
Yep.
Well,
Not sure what that
which brings the question to me is, are you creating an ordinance to benefit a few, but then you may be adding so many bad potential things that could ruin what was a good cause? All right, somebody wants to do a chamber-related pumpkin theme on one side, and now we've opened the door for many negative things. And my other question is, when you say right now murals fall under our sign ordinance, so if I wanted to do a mural, I could, but I'd go through and get a sign permit?
You wouldn't
How
be
does that
able
work?
to paint it on the building because our ordinance doesn't allow that. It'd have to be a sign.
So you really can't.
Clarify that again. You couldn't do a mural on the building through our sign ordinance?
Right.
Okay.
You can't paint
So-
a building.
You'd have to
Can't
paint it
sign
on
the
a
building.
medium and then attach it to the building?
And our sign requirements in terms of minimum
Square footage and-
maximum square footage
Yeah.
for signs would likely interfere with any large-scale mural.
There's no way of adding something to our sign ordinance that could deal with this other than start creating this whole new ordinance for just murals? I'm just wondering, I'm not thrilled, and I definitely don't like the idea that Roger, or whoever's in his position, is the one singular guy that gets this before him and he says yay or nay. I mean, I wouldn't want to be you, because if it's a horrible looking thing, you're gonna have all these people saying, who approved this? One guy in town.
Well, according to the sign ordinance, you can't even see what it looks like before he approves it. It's
Well,
just gonna
that's
be,
true,
there's
yeah.
a mural. So,
That's very difficult.
And we're talking about
Police.
ordinances here, but he'd be violating the Constitution of the United States
Yeah.
by denying certain messages. That's a pretty big deal.
But I agree. I like them. I like the way they look. I mean, most of them I feel like are done very well.
It goes
would
back to
add-
that vibrant community,
It
that
would add to the
downtown environment.
community. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I'm a big fan of, but I think that we have to figure out how to not let bad apples spoil the bunch.
I like the idea of certain corners, like starting it out like that. I mean,
Right.
I'm pretty confident that Beckendorf is not gonna put something crazy up there, right?
Right.
In lieu of saying specific corners, and whether you could, whether this would be a palatable change for you guys,
Not comprehensive.
it would interact better with your code to say certain zoning districts.
Right.
Right, like the
Like
downtown
downtown.
district.
Downtown district.
I don't think any of you probably envision a mural in, in the interstate corridor or some, I think most probably, your logic goes to downtown business district.
So you've got a economic development plan or land use plan or something that shows the mural on a specific building already that's been adopted by the village. So I don't know why you couldn't, if you wanted to start with that corner, why you couldn't start there? Because apparently was accepted by the village board because they didn't chuck it out of the plan when they approved it.
See, along those lines, I think I'd prefer if it was on a public building, where you know there are a group of people that are making a determination about what's going to go on the building, and not a private business.
You bring the good ones, don't you?
I stay up at night thinking of these things.
Do we complicate this even further by referring to murals on sidewalks? Chalk murals, you know, you have during the punk festival, you open a certain section of sidewalk up for anybody to come in and do chalk murals. In big cities have some really great murals that they do. Most of them aren't permanent though, so you can wash them off, but.
They did that, was it last year or this year?
They've done it a
Over
couple
by
years, yeah, over by.
Heartland Bank is
Yeah.
behind that parking lot.
I say this not to shape your discussion, but at least to give you context. I think there's basically one request for this, so it's not as if there's overwhelming public demand to open the doors. So if
Or
it's a
interest.
regulatory framework that you guys struggle to find a consensus on, you know, that may speak to where we
Yeah,
go from here.
I mean, clearly, you know, the table's in agreement that the specific use that was brought up initially is something that I'm sure we're all a fan of. I mean, anything community-driven, so I'm sure we can figure out some way to formulate language that allows for that. But once that's up, there is the possibility that other requests may come in, and I do think we need to think about how we want to look at this thing, because I feel like we're at a juncture as a community where we're striking a very good balance between the community, the good, clean, community-driven sort of brand that Morton has established for many years, but also not being xenophobic to new ideas, businesses, and philosophies that are going to bring additional families to this community. Because it's something that we have to be really concerned over as we look forward. The ebbs and flows of the economy will always affect a community such as Morton because we're not right in the center of everything. We're just outside. And so when we make these decisions, I want to make sure that we're inclusive of neat new ideas. One of the things I find that I run into from time to time are 30-somethings who grew up here, promised their whole time in high school they just couldn't wait to get out of this town, went to school in another state, and then as soon as they decided to have a family, they come back to this community because they love what their youth was, and they want to try to replicate that. But now they're bringing new ideas. They're bringing, things that they did out west in Colorado or things they did out east. They'd like to have those same opportunities here, and I think that's what's going to drive this community into the future, is keeping these great young families, or bringing them back. So I don't want to just be, completely a no on all these neat ideas. And I think the downtown developments that have taken place in just the past couple of years speak tremendously of what's been happening at this table and with the trustees and this community in general. Those things were unheard of just 10 years ago. To think that we'd have a brand new 38,000 square foot facility, mixed use downtown, to have this new restaurant and bar open that's 6,000 square feet or something like that, to have multiple petitions annually for mixed use or for new businesses in the downtown district in a recessing economy. It's a terrific thing. So I like the idea that we continue to have these kinds of discussions. The concerns are there, right? It's an incendiary time, both politically. A lot of communities are split right now on certain hot topics, and I think that the introduction of a mural ordinance with zero ability to sort of regulate is at the same time scary as it is impressive to be discussing. But I just don't see this table getting around it. I think it's too much, it's just too much open-ended.
I'd be interested in a creative solution. Like I said, for public entities to do it, whether that's on a public building or whether that's if there's some creative way for a public entity to get the rights on a private building. pay $1 for the rights, or I don't know, that's more of a legal issue. But if there's a way for a public entity to gain control of whatever site it is, I think I would feel comfortable moving forward with that. I think, to your point, to not squelch everything, but to also approach it in a less risky way. So I don't know what avenues are out there, but I'm just kind of starting the ball rolling. If there's some creative solution to get a public entity in control of it, I think I'd be in favor of looking into that.
If the Planning Commission and later the trustees were to review a special use request in an overlay district that allowed for murals, and they kept roughly the same principles that are currently being proposed for Roger. We don't, the commissions don't see it in advance, they don't, but the petitioner comes and explains why they want this. Or have we at that time opened the village up to legal recourse if they deny it?
Yes, because that suggests that approval will be given on a case-by-case basis. You essentially, what this ordinance proposes, which is what you need, is some objective, firmly verifiable standards. Yes, I meet your requirements, or no, I don't. And the problem with the special use is, you guys, there isn't, it's not mathematical. There aren't 5 factors, and if you meet all these 5, essentially, and I guess my one response to those saying it's up to Roger to give the yay or nay vote, his function is purely ministerial in
Right,
that
it's not a yay.
he looks and says, do you meet all of our requirements? And if
Right.
they do, he has to give it to them.
Right.
So there's not an element of discretion under that, and no matter how you tweak it, it's important for the village's liability control standpoint to avoid creating a system where there's even the impression that it's a discretionary call as to whether or not. The closest thing you could come is you could have, and we do this in other scenarios, you could limit the number of permits you issue for murals. So you could say, we think this is a good idea in moderation. So like we do liquor licenses or other types of things, we could say we'll have 1 mural permit available and see how that goes. And
Well, can a business a public entity contingency be considered a content neutral criteria? That it has to be a public entity?
are you saying,
Can't that be one of the content neutral criteria? It's a certain size.
that murals are only available for public entities?
Wouldn't
Yes.
that be
Yes,
a way of
yes.
guaranteeing that we'll never have a mural?
Pardon me?
That would be a way of guaranteeing that we'll never have a mural. I mean, if
Well, what about-
money
Well, if
has
the
to be
village,
spent on it.
well, I didn't know about the rights that the village could have on a public, on a private building.
Okay.
Can it still
What if
be
it's
the-
community driven though? I think it goes for, so what you're, I get where you're coming from. So let's say we create some sort of an ordinance that is administrated by a public party. For example, let's use the Chamber of Commerce. If the Chamber of Commerce is presenting these, and we have a downtown overlay district that we state they're allowed in this area, but they're only allowed when the Chamber of Commerce has presented to a business, and basically they're a broker, for lack of a better term, on behalf of the artist, and the artist is it's being negotiated with the building owner between those two parties. And that way we know the chamber is involved, and so the people who are bringing it to the table are, in essence, business owners that are community-driven business owners. They're members, they're involved. We don't need to know what it is, we just approve the locations, but it becomes more of a private entity. So in the example, poor Jim's being brought into this a lot, but in the example that the Benkendorf building is being presented by this, the Chamber of Commerce would approach Benkendorf with this idea, introduce them to the artist, and they would determine that building was in the downtown district. It is in the mural district, if you will. And then they make it happen. In that particular case, we're not arbitrating it, but we're fairly certain that the Chamber of Commerce, who's being approached by the artist, is is presenting something that's pro-business or pro-Morton.
The concern about that, from liability control standpoint, is I think one could make a reasonable argument that the Chamber of Commerce is acting as a agent, whether apparent or actual authority to do so, if our regulatory framework requires them to be involved and puts them involved in content design, especially in light of the varied interrelationships between the two entities.
Could you have what if you had a contest? What if the chamber had a contest and they got people to submit their ideas or whatever, and then they could select 5 that they liked, and then those 5 could be permitted?
Same issue is, I think one could make an argument that the chamber is acting as an arm of the village in reviewing and approving content.
So I'm going to recommend that we table this, followed by 2 questions. First one is, and it's kind of a complicated question or comment, and that is that, this started with a photograph or a drawing that was done by a company, a consultant that we hired to come up with a way to enhance our downtown. And so they put a mural in, they put a mural in there for some reason. And so I guess I would, and on the other hand, they also suggested mixed-use development, which we have done. They suggested a plaza, which we have done. And so my question is there some way that we can write an ordinance that actually encourages what we want instead of being so defensive, perhaps? Is there something like the mixed use? We're actually encouraging mixed use development with our mixed use ordinance, and it's working. And so is it possible that we go, and by doing that, I'm saying maybe, do we need to go, I'd like to ask that consultant,
Right.
why did you show a mural? Is that part of your, because they've done some, some of the nice, there's some nice things in what they are proposing. And then secondly, do you have a suggested mural? I mean, how do we decide, how do we keep murals
Right. How did that?
in the, the Morton murals and not something that we all regret? Let's just ask them that question. And maybe we could, use this framework that we've got in front of us and amend it in some way. Maybe there's, a magic bullet in there somewhere that we don't know about. And then the second question is the question we've asked about on every one of these tonight, and that is what other towns do? What does Peoria do? What is their, when that restaurant on the corner of Main and University, One World.
Yeah.
It's got that big mural, which
There are several
it's
in
a
the
nice
downtown
solution
area.
to an ugly building on the
Yep.
back. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's actually. And so how did they get permission to do that? Is that something that they just did, or does Peoria have an ordinance on that? And
I'm going to assume they have an ordinance, and we should look into it. They had, there are several new murals or newer murals in the downtown district, the warehouse phase 1 and 2 for the Peoria area that I've noted. One of them changes every couple of months, and it's pretty elaborate. It's by the C.T. Gabbard building. So I think that's probably a smart approach to this, is to at first go back and maybe have this conversation with the consultants and find out, I think we know the answer, but what is it about these murals that they like? I suspect the answer is that it helps promote that vibrant community, and it shows that there's some life in that downtown, and it does, in fact, cover up buildings that might not have a lot of aesthetic standards. The other option is then to find out, okay, this is why they've included it. How would they how do they police it? How do they make certain that the right messages are out there? Now, I suspect their answer is going to be what we've come up with here, that the public will overall make that determination. If you're a business and you put something that offends 40% of the population, you're probably in trouble.
Yeah, our culture is going to dictate it.
It does. To that extent, I think you'll see mostly neutral artwork. But agreed, there's always that opportunity. So I think that's a really smart play as we kind of look at what the surrounding communities that are taking some of this stuff on. Let's look at what they've done. Let's review again. I suggest everybody at the table does go ahead and continue to look at this, write on it, make some commentary so that at the next meeting when we bring this back, we can have hopefully some thoughtful conclusions to how we handle this ordinance. Thank you for drafting all this, by the way.
I believe
Speaking of
I have a
artwork,
question for you. Does the owner of the building actually have control over the content?
We require, as part of this ordinance, we do require consent from the building owner.
So he has the option of approving or not approving the content?
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just one question. I wonder, talking about murals, but what about sculptures? Should we include sculptures into this as well? Because maybe somebody's going to want to put something up like that, not on the wall, but on their business property.
I mean, artwork in general is something that we're starting to see in a lot of these communities. You know, I'll use it as an example again, but you look at phase 1 of the downtown warehouse district for Peoria and streetscaping, sculptures, gas lights. You know, there's a tremendous amount that goes into the aesthetic appeal of these things to make them look like vibrant environments. So I think it's a smart idea to try to look at all this at once. I think one answer will lead us to the other with regard to how those things are arbitrated or policed as far as making sure that what's the end product is what the public wants. Once we get around that question, I think that there's no doubt we should add potentially all artwork to this ordinance. I'd love to see some additional things in our downtown, and we already do. I mean, we have at this time, I think there was a discussion with the Chamber of Commerce that I recall that they talked about a sculpture. If Leanne might be bringing that to the public to discuss at some point, if she hasn't already. I mean, it's a conversation that's going to continue for sure. So I think it's smart to include that in this upcoming conversation. I mean, clearly the thing that this table is hooked on here is being nervous that the wrong messages are being put out. And I don't want to talk anybody necessarily out of that concern at this time. I do worry that in our positions, if we get too defensive and we make decisions based on the worst case scenario too often, we will get stuck in neutral. So I think it's good to table this and come back with more knowledge and hopefully find a conclusion. So with that in mind, Mr. Keach, was that a motion to table this conversation?
I can make it one. I move that we table item 4 in public hearing.
So the motion is made to table the conversation regarding making amendments regarding murals to section 10.8, chapter 9, title 10. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Call when ready.
Ritterbusch,
Yes.
Smock,
Yes.
Westlake,
Yes.
Zobrist,
Yes.
Farrell,
Yes.
Keach,
Yes.
Knapp,
Yes.
Fick.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, Roger, it's going to come back to get you next month.
I just want to mention one thing on those, the real estate, those temporary real estate signs, directional signs. I did also talk to the Greater Peoria Realtor Association.
PAR, yeah.
And they're going to, whatever our decision is, if the board approves this, then they put that in some newsletter or something that pops up when you go to their website. So
Okay.
that everybody, we're not just getting it to a few realtors in Morton, but it'll go out to the numbers.
It'll go out to all the realtors that are a member of the Peoria Association, which in the residential world, that's most of them. And I'm sure they'll put something in there appropriate that says Roger Spangler has denied your ability to sell property.
I only can hope they do that, yeah.
Okay, so that concludes public hearing portion of our meeting tonight. Let's go to other business. Is there anything from you?
No, I just appreciate your input from each one of you tonight, so
Of course.
it makes it work.
Steve Lanier, anything from you?
Well done.
All right. So with that in mind, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion made, second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All right. Thanks, guys.